Hey everybody, PJ Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. I am waiting on Will to come in. I got comms on him here. Just thought I would pop in and get the show started just to satisfy the software requirements on scheduling because software runs our lives, Wi-Fi runs our lives, and so I thought we would just make everybody happy and just get things started here. So just give me a moment or two here, and we will be able to get things going. I've got a little bit of an echo on my end, so I'm going to work on fixing that. So we'll turn the echo canceling on and off, and hopefully that'll fix that. And let's see here. Yeah, okay, so he's on the way. He'll be here soon. I guess, hey, if you haven't watched the show before, thanks for coming to the Break It Down show. Hopefully you guys are long listeners and you know me well already. But if not, I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Pete. I used to be a spy. I used to work in combat zones. I've got a lot of missions outside the wire. We often talk about combat. We talked about combat earlier today with John Spencer, and he is. Oh, let's see. What do we got here? Oh yeah, what's up, Dick? Dick's in. And so we talk about spy stuff. We talk about combat. We talk about all kinds of things with modern war, but also music. We talk about all kinds of academic issues, anything really. Authors from all stripes, and we know a lot of people. Here comes Will.
How are you?
How are you?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Right. Nice. All right. I got to figure out why I have an echo. Hopefully that echo is gone. I'm not sure what's causing that. Okay, good. I think my echo is gone. Hey, I want to get us started. Thanks for coming on the show, man, and doing this. Today we're talking about Thomas Sowell's book, Civil Rights. And how funny is this? We timed this well. The Supreme Court came down with a decision knocking back affirmative action into being illegal. It's interesting. In California a while back, we had a thing with admissions where we said, hey, we're not going to consider race anymore. And we have struggled to create racial diversity in our schools in part because of it. And so because of that, we've taken the SAT and the ACT out of schools. What are your thoughts on the Supreme Court's decision?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. I'm basically for it. The big problem with affirmative action today is that it doesn't make as much sense in modern America as it used to. I had a screen pop up on my computer. Okay, just minimize that. So yeah, the argument for affirmative action originally, at least until you got to Bakke, was, and we've been doing affirmative action at the collegiate level, if we're being honest, since the 1950s, 1960s. But the argument was Black people and maybe natives have been victimized by this country. There used to be a lot of racism. So we're going to put policies in place that assume that part of, a test score disadvantage between groups or whatnot is due to past racism. And so you're going to get a 200-point boost if you're Black or something like that. And the Bakke case, the first big affirmative action case, I believe 1978, actually said that you can't have hard quota systems when it comes to affirmative action. So that case dealt with a medical school that set aside, I think, 15% of the seats for sort of recognized minorities, which as always means Black, Hispanic, and Native American Indian. And a white guy who got a really good MCAT score but didn't quite qualify. He didn't get into Davis. He didn't get into Berkeley. Sues and says, look, had I been in this 15% of the class, I would have gotten into medical school. This is just racism. So the court in Bakke says you can't explicitly say that such and such a percentage of your class is going to be Blacks or Latinos, but you can use race as, quote unquote, one of many factors when it comes to admission, which has become a trick that's gone on for decades since then. But the big reason for that, first, they said you can try to compensate for past discrimination. And second, they said that diversity is sort of an academic goal, like just having people that are Black, brown, white together is a good thing. So, and someone, Ouroboros a la Richard, says a ton of people seem upset about this online. Yeah, people are freaking out, but kind of getting to the point from my end, this has all seemed to become more and more illogical in the modern USA because we're no longer a white and Black country with a few Indians. I mean, the country is 7% Asian American. Hispanics are actually the biggest group in the country. So there are way more Hispanics than there are Black Americans. Hispanics are, I think, 18.2% of the population. Blacks are 12.1%. Hispanics are steadily growing. Groups like Asians, groups like Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews are outperforming what most people think of as whites on the SAT. So you were getting into this weird situation where, if you want to talk about, rationale one, past discrimination, very often the person getting clipped for college admissions at Berkeley or at Harvard in favor of, the hardworking son of a Mexican immigrant wouldn't be white at all. They'd be the hardworking son of a Vietnamese immigrant. And that really made no sense to anyone. Like, there's not a great deal of discrimination, no offense to a great group, but that kind of post 1965 Caucasian Hispanics have suffered on the West Coast or in the U.S. North. And most of the people are white, technically speaking. They're Caucasian. Pete, you've talked to me about the difference between those two and so on. But I mean, and even when you get into the diversity rationale, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to say that a Nigerian guy, although he might fall into the black category, but an Asian guy, a South Asian guy, a Jewish guy is quote unquote less diverse than a Cuban guy. You're talking about a situation where in this very mixed up applicant pool, you're just kind of privileging groups at random. And it gets almost silly. So like people from Portugal are brown-skinned Latin Americans, but they're not considered Hispanics because they're not Spanish speaking. So they don't, you can check this out, they don't benefit from affirmative action. They're just regular whites unless they're black. Like if you're Portuguese or Brazilian, and almost everyone in those populations is partially of African descent. But if you're over the line enough that you consider yourself black, then you can be a black applicant. But other than that, you're just a white guy. And all of you, of course, look just like the other Hispanics around you. So people started looking at this kind of silly situation, la mezcla, it's often called in Latin American discussions, and saying, well, this doesn't make any damn sense. And that played a big role in the court's decision. And kind of, I'm going on a little bit here, but like fairness was brought entirely by Asian and South Asian plaintiffs. Like you might correct this by one kid, but there weren't any whites involved. So when you look at this and you see, well, these are the people that are complaining about these advantages being given to blacks, and half the blacks are from like, the island paradise cities of Jamaica, you're not talking about remedying slavery anymore. So I'm not surprised at all.
And just like these categories that are so made up, we've talked about Asians before. Like, when are you not an Asian anymore? Are Sri Lankans Asians? Are Armenians Asians? I mean, yes. Are Lebanese people Asians? Yes. Are Iraqis Asians? Yes. And like it's
the USA though.
And then, right, but I mean, they technically are actual Asians. They are on the Asian continent. And then you have mestizos. Are they Mexicans or are they Native Americans? Well, they're both, but they're not accounted for when they come across. They want to go to Davis, UC Davis. What are they? They're mixed. Well, I'm mixed. Oh, well, come on. I mean, it gets to be silly when you're trying to correct something, and we have a made up thing like Hispanics, which means literally nothing. And so we've talked about these terms before, but it's always good to remind ourselves that like white is not even a category. It's giving up if you're really trying to create some kind of diversity. I wanted to get in a little bit more into the actual case because this goes into what the book is. And it's interesting because you have Clarence Thomas, who's always reviled by half of the population and they hate him. And then you have Justice Brown. And these are both fantastic lawyers. And it's interesting, if you read her dissent, you get about 100 words in and she finally cites something, and it's not case law. Look, and I'm not a lawyer, but I try to read these as much as I can. I try to read these decisions, and I read her dissent, and the first thing she cites is an academic paper, and it's straight out of like what Sowell is saying, hey, don't do this. And it talks about like the thing she cites is what he's saying in his book is like, hey, don't do this. This is not what you're supposed to do. And it talks about inequality and gaps. And so this is a great place to start. Meanwhile, conversely, Thomas can't go 20 words without citing a case or a paper written about a case or a dissent or, so all this stuff is all written in legal things. And, nobody doubts that Thomas knows how to write about legal things, but it's just so interesting that as we're talking about this, this dissent is based upon the exact thing that Sowell talks about in his book from decades ago.
Yeah, I mean, so there are actually a couple points here. First of all, shout to this guy, Oroboro Sala Richard, on the right side of the page. He says that the argument for affirmative action confuses me because diversity of thought has little to do with skin color or even ethnicity. Yeah, that's correct. I mean, so like one of the arguments for affirmative action is, well, we need this as a proxy. We find that when we look at the psych literature, like blacks, for example, and whites tend to have different political perspectives. So blacks tend to be conservative Democrats, whites tend to be moderate Republicans. So you need a diversity of political thought on campus, and race helps you get that. Or Hispanics in particular, as blacks and Asians move up, are more likely to be working class than whites, even though, Pete, as you point out, like half the Hispanics are white. We're all just bullshitting here. But okay, so the argument is, well, we need some working class tradesman types, and that's why we need these Latinos. But the obvious point that every good faith conservative makes is, well, then why don't you just target kids from working class union families or conservative kids? Like if race is a proxy that we would say correlates at 0.3, why don't we just throw race out totally? And why don't we look for hardworking working class kids? Why don't we look for conservative kids? Why don't we look for Christians? Why don't we get all those people and incidentally get almost the same level of racial diversity we have now? And I don't think there's a counter argument to that. The answer is that wouldn't, I mean, and I think me and Ouroboros would probably agree on that. The answer is that wouldn't get what the schools are looking for, which is 12.4% blacks. That's the answer. I mean, that's as simple as it is. Like the goal of affirmative action. This is one of those areas where a lot of smoke screens have been thrown up, like diversity, improvement of conversation, so on. No, the goal is getting 60% whites, getting 12% blacks. I've been an academic executive. The goal is proportional representation so you don't get sued. So everything else is just bullshit. So, I mean, thanks to the gentleman contributing in the comments, but that's the answer there. Your comment on, and this will, I think, get into the main conversation. Like when you contrast Clarence Thomas and Ketanji Brown Jackson, they are both good lawyers in the sense that by the end of my law school training, I was probably a pretty good lawyer, assuming, getting the degree, clearing the bar. But that's a broad category. That include everyone from, us to Abraham Lincoln. There's no comparison directly between those two. I mean, Thomas or Scalia is clearly a far better justice. And again, one of those guys is black, one's Italian American. There's no racial contrast there, really. But I mean, there's no comparison in terms of legal skill between Clarence Thomas or Mr. Justice Scalia and Ketanji Brown Jackson. I mean, Ben Shapiro, the conservative commentator, said only half jokingly that the dissents in this case read like articles in Jacobin magazine or a college newspaper. And I kind of think the Darth Vader of debates is right about that. I mean, you don't see a lot of hard legal citation. You don't even see a lot of. Yeah. No, it's really pretty remarkable for a court. You don't even see a lot of quantitative methods tables from like better scientific papers. What you see is a lot of one-off individual statistics. And now we're getting really into the book, but like black babies are twice as likely to die if they have a white doctor as versus a black doctor. And this is the direct segue here because Thomas Sowell's great contribution to social science, among others, I mean, in addition to the conflict of visions, basic economics, some more theoretical stuff. But the point he just makes over and over again at a methodological level where like the average doctor or lawyer can understand it and pressure the social scientists they know to apply that in their research is that disparities don't equal discrimination. Disparities can be caused by a number of things. Genetics. I mean, that's the taboo one we're not supposed to mention. I don't think when you look at like Scotsmen versus West Africans, that plays a big role at all, honestly, looking at history, if any role. But I mean, like men and women, that's the big factor. But then there's culture. That to me is the big one between races and ethnicities. How do you study? What's your attitude towards school? Region, past racism as versus present, systems, is there welfare in your country or not? All of this, stochastic variables, almost lucky ones. Like I always bring up age differences between groups. If you're looking at crimes other than homicide, you're looking at wealth. I mean, this is a third of the gap right there. So Sowell makes that point, but almost all of what we're talking about when we argue against Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo is like people coming from a pre-Bronze Age world where they've never heard of Tom Sowell or Milton Friedman or Charles Murray or anything like that. And they're just looking at the gap and they're calling it racism. It really is that simple. Like the black babies, last line, but the black baby's twice as likely to die if they have a white doctor as versus a black doctor. People from Steve Saylor on the right to Tim Weiss on the left, although I'm sure very grudgingly in that second case, have pointed out, like, you have to look at what type of doctors are involved in what type of cases. Like, so for example, you would assume that most of the most advanced specialists in the medical field would be older, the highest board scores possible, thus disproportionately likely to be white or even Jewish/Asian. And those would be the people that would be taking on the hardcore cases, the baby born with two hearts, neither functional. So just saying, like, the pool, black doctors are actually pretty good these days, but like the pool of black doctors, if they have half as many of those cases, isn't going to have twice as many surviving births and tough cases. That doesn't mean anything. You'd have to look at the level of risk for each pregnancy, and then the percentage of deaths at each level of pregnancy risk among black, white, but also Spanish, Asian, so on doctors. That's how you'd have to do that. And I'm like a competent social scientist. I thought of that in 20 minutes, but that doesn't appear in 20 seconds. But that doesn't appear in the Brown-Jackson opinion. So you're looking at bad social science as opposed to good law.
Yeah, we love to take numbers and just like put a little narrow column and like, see, look, these little tiny numbers right here prove my point. I saw a thing about the how the internal combustion engine is obsolete because the electric engine is so much more efficient. Like, yes, in this one little narrow sliver of the entire energy cycle, you're right. But go light a match to air and see if it burns. Like, oh, it's right. It doesn't, and you go light a match to oil-filled dirt and it will burn. So you've got to like look at the whole problem when you think about a poor person who has a sick baby and has 3 jobs to survive. That baby is in a lot more peril. So wealth is probably a much bigger indicator to a baby's survivability. The distance to a doctor or reliable transportation, all these things. Money is probably a much more reliable predictor of that. One of the things that Thomas Sowell talks about too, and it's along the lines that you just said, was the variability of a job. And I'm always struck by we get so wrapped up in white and black, and really a lot of this is geography, because that is not a problem in, say, Iowa or even Arizona. Right? It's a very Eastern problem, and so if you're an Ethiopian guy, you come here from another, Ethiopia, and you arrive, you're going to arrive where the Ethiopian enclave is, and you're going to get your job in DC working toll booths or mopping up at the DC airports, because that's where your uncles are, and they take you in and you get your first job. And then your next job is there because that's where the next job is. And that's repeated all throughout the nation when you're an immigrant and you get started there. So you don't hop into working at a refinery in my hometown of Benicia, because that's just not available. That's too far of a leap to go. And so some of these decision cones are decided for you because of where the uncles are and where the support system is. That's not racism. It's geography, it's family, it's familiarity, it's affinity, and it has nothing to do with the color of your skin. It has all of these other factors are accounted for way before you get to race or racism.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I think we've kind of covered this one, but it's just multivariate analysis, really. I mean,
Right.
Like, you have to break out, as they do in business, as they do in the military, as they do certainly in social science. You have to break out, state or SPSS or whatever, and have the one guy that knows how to do that look at what happens when you throw in all the variables. So yeah, I mean, if you're looking at something like the one I started out researching when I entered academia was group wealth gaps, and those were almost invariably attributed to racism. And without going through a paper everyone's heard about already by now, I mean, if you adjust for age, region, 50% of blacks still live in the South, test scores, the gap goes away. It goes down to like 1%, which is probably the actual impact of racism or sexism. I don't think anyone disagrees. There's even a 2 or 3% impact there. That's bad. We should stop that. But what you can't do is point at, the feminists do this all the time, point at like 59 cents to the male dollar as a technical average earning rate for women and say, look at that sexism. What you're not doing if you do that is recognizing that a third of the women are like happy housewives. Their technical earnings are 0. But if you're in a happy marriage, they probably control the money for that family. Like, it's just meaningless to say that. Like Jane in the background, her income's not 0. It's half of mine. That's how that functions for the majority of families. But that's dollar by dollar, and it's hard to break that down. And this goes into other things. I mean, I look at race and IQ sometimes. One of the things that is hard to adjust for with race and IQ, but pretty obvious, is region and the cultural effects we're talking about. So like the black IQ is lower than the white IQ. It's between 86 and 92 tested right now. Whites are at 100. But also, again, 50+% of the black population lives in the South, where IQs across everyone are significantly lower. I mean, if you look at a state like Georgia, this is probably whites and blacks combined, but average IQ is 91, 92. West Virginia, I happen to know the average IQ for whites is 93. So in order to break out how blacks are doing overall, look at whether there's what the cultural component or even some small genetic component of that would be, you'd first have to disentangle from environment. Like, what's the black-white gap in each of those states? And outside of like some alt-right website or some HOTEP website, I've almost never seen anyone try to do that. So yeah, the point isn't that sorry, I got distracted by one of these comments on the side. Bad use of the BLS data. I don't think this is by either one of us, but yeah, all this stuff is pretty complicated across the board. Anyway, but to actually figure out the impact of something like racism, I mean, this is a one sentence comment. You first have to adjust for everything else that might be in play. Like, what are the differences in test scores, whatever the causal role of IQ in that between groups? What are the differences in region and regional income between groups, age between groups? And this is simple stuff. I mean, you can take this up to more complex levels when you look at things like rate of police stops. You know, what's the rate of expired tags among different ethnic groups? I would bet, just based on where I live, that's that used to, I mean, I would bet that there probably is an edge for, say, Hispanic men there. But until you know all of that stuff, you really can't figure anything out in terms of what prejudice levels are.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, so Sowell talks for a while. This book is old enough that he talks for a while about the the Equal Rights Amendment, and that was a thing in the 70s and 80s, especially coming out of the Civil Rights Movement. But let me back up, because the Civil Rights Movement thing is a main thing of this. And if you look at history and you look up civil rights movements from other countries, it just doesn't exist. You know, we have a lot of pride in this, that we had this movement, and it makes you feel good about yourself. Like, we really did something in the 60s and made a difference. And then Sowell starts taking the damn thing apart, and you're like, God damn it. You know, we were doing better in so many ways. If you want to, you know, listen to the master talk, and you think, God damn it, maybe these things are dangerous. And then I'm not sure if these are his words or the reviewer's words, but this quote I found is great. It's, political action has neither been successful nor necessary in improving the condition of various immigrant groups in America. And that rings true to me, because I always talking about, you can't presume to improve the condition of someone or something you refuse to understand the condition of. And so political action rarely ever works reliably, because we refuse to take the steps to understand the problem. And this goes right back to Sowell. He's like, you know, what is the condition of this thing? What is the problem? Is it getting better or getting worse? And then you throw, you know, civil rights into this thing, and you're like, that we made it worse. Like, we don't have what we want, but we're so passionate about it that we lose our ability to reliably look at the problem and go, we need to back out of this. People were actually solving their own problems at a rate better than what we could do for ourselves.
Yeah, well, I think there are two things there. Okay. Three things there. First of all, yeah, the USA is a pretty good country in the way that, you know, societies made by predatory apes can be good. I'm not standing every aspect of the nation's history. But yeah, we do have a claim to one of the few unique internal civil rights movements around the world. I mean, India could actually say the same. Yeah. Another rising large democracy with Mahatma Gandhi over there. But yeah, that's an extreme positive. I mean, it was the Western world led by the USA and Britain that abolished slavery. So it wasn't black folks that did that. There were very highly civilized black countries at that time, Ashanti, Benin, nations with flags that fought the British out in the ocean, but they were slave traders. They did not want to get rid of slavery. We had to fight the mixed Moorish/black Barbary pirates to get them to stop selling all the damn slaves. So, I mean, there's some great honorable history to be proud of in the USA. Even with this affirmative action thing, I mean, Sowell also wrote a book called Affirmative Action Around the World, or Affirmative Action in a Global Context. And one of the points he makes is that once you entrench an affirmative action program, unless you have a very effective court system outside the legislature, you're never getting rid of it. Right. And we do. So we may just have become the only major nation to ever get rid of deep-seated historical affirmative action. And remember, we had affirmative action for something like 60 years. We always hear that slavery endured for 400 years. And that's not really accurate. I mean, without going off on a side rant here, I mean, the USA began in 1776. We're not responsible for what the Iroquois or our own British oppressors or the non-white Spaniards did in this country before, the country began. So we had slaves from 1776. I'm not going to cheat and say like 1783 or something, but 1776 to 1865, that's it. That's 89 years. And we haven't from then on, which is almost 200 years. So, I mean, that's just, it is what it is. We had affirmative action for nearly as long as we had slavery. We had affirmative action in place for something like 6 decades. Even if you want to date it to the Philadelphia Plan in 1967, instead of when the colleges started implementing it, I mean, that would be, 56 years, just thinking off the top of the head. So we got rid of this very entrenched program because we thought it was unjust. And that's something that I've only seen Western countries do. So that is a point of pride. That should be a talking point for us as Western tax-paying citizens. But the deeper question that you got into here is something that, and this is why the book we're talking about today is Civil Rights, Rhetoric, and Reality. And this has been called Tom Sowell's most controversial book, which surprised me until I thought about it. And I think the reason that you could call Civil Rights, Rhetoric, or Reality the most controversial is that Sowell is challenging something that we just both praised, which is kind of this aspect of American legend. That the civil rights movement was one of the things that made the country functional. And his point is that Black people, and he also talks about Irishmen, Asian Americans, most groups in the USA advanced more significantly prior to the Civil Rights Act than they did after it. In fact, if you look at the impact of welfare, Blacks, and I'd argue urban Irishmen also stopped advancing after the Civil Rights Act. So he's making this very deep point, which is that culture is a more significant predictor of how groups do than political power is. And that's something that we almost never talk about these days. But something that he says very explicitly, like there are multiple strategies for groups to use to pursue success. And pursuing success through the political process, like we're going to essentially anoint someone as the Black leader or the ward boss in those ethnic white communities, and we're going to wait for him to bring home largesse for us, that's a much less successful strategy than focusing on education for everyone in the community, as Asian communities do, holding town meetings where you set up something like a study schedule for young people. Everyone has some training in how to be a small merchant, knows how to do taxes. That second strategy, and I could go through 15 more points beyond that on kind of the expanded success sequence. I won't, I'm sure your audience would be bored to tears, but that second strategy is more successful.
We talked, I think it was last time, about Rockies and other cultures where you're bound to your tribe and what you're allowed to do. And it's like, hey, I'm hoping to get married and open a shop, because that's what I'm allowed to do. And one of the amazing things about our world here is that you can come here from another place and you can do whatever you want to do. You can go to UC Davis and learn whatever you want, choir, it's like, and we'll pay for it. We'll pay for it, and it's just an amazing thing. So we get wrapped up in this belief that nobody has a chance, and Thomas talks about it in his concurrence with the court. He's like, don't limit people, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he's like, just go out and do it. And I think he even admits, he's like, I was a product of affirmative action. So when we look at getting past this and saying, hey, we're just no longer going to hinder all these Asian folks that are doing great things. We're going to, force Harvard to figure out a different way to play the game. What is the new way to play the game? Is it Harvard is just full of Asian people and they just do that? Or do they rejigger and cheat and get sued?
Well, there are two options there. One thing I want to say, and again, some great comments from Ouroboros, some great comments on the side. But one thing I would say about this whole Civil Rights Act thing, also, I don't think the Civil Rights Act was bad. Right. So, like, people will sometimes often say, Black people were doing, and for that matter, I've heard this about, like I said, Italian, some of the other groups were mentioning, people were doing better under conditions of moderate repression that held down that animal nature. That I don't think that's accurate. I think, obviously, the impact of the Civil Rights Act, where you could go into a barbecue restaurant and order food from anyone of any race, that's a good thing. So the Civil Rights Act is a good positive law. The problem with the Civil Rights Act, 1964, because we'd had previous civil rights acts that did almost as much, had no negative impact, is that it was part of that general Great Society package that also included welfare for unmarried teenage mothers. I mean, that also included the first steps of criminal justice reform, so on. So in general, excessive liberalism is terrible for societies. And it's kind of unfortunate that civil rights in the USA, I don't know if this is inevitable, but got caught up in that. Just the basic rule that you can't discriminate against people in business. I mean, would probably have had a 5 or 6% positive impact on blacks or on ethnic whites if that had happened independent of this other stuff. But I mean, Sowell's point is that the cultural development that had happened before the Civil Rights Act was more important in terms of black development than the Civil Rights Act itself. And so you ended up seeing a negative overall impact when the Civil Rights Act countered a lot of that cultural development. I mean, it took a long time for black people who are these sort of captured African warriors who were thrown into this promiscuous plantation environment where, you know, Massa was screwing around too. He had 2 mistresses and 4 slave concubines to really get back on what you had in West Africa and Europe, which is sort of stable marriage. So by the end of the Civil War, you had a lot of free blacks. By then, you had 25% illegitimacy rate among black people. And this dropped by 1938, famous Walter Williams paper, to 11%. And at that point, whites were at 4 or 5%. So you're catching up. You're getting really close. And to some extent, when you look at whether you're talking about IQ or crime or whatever, if the gap is like 5% versus 10%, nobody really cares. It becomes impolite to talk about. But as the post-civil rights infrastructure hit, I mean, the black illegitimacy rate ballooned to 75%. I mean, it was 73.4% or whatever it was. Whites are now at 35%. So you saw a really negative overall impact of all this stuff. But to actually get to your point, I mean, you're asking, so what's Harvard going to do? They've got 2 options. One is that they actually just admit the best students. What? And something people have pointed out for years, decades, is that the whole idea of college admissions being complicated is not necessarily the case. I mean, I've been an executive, at least at that ombudsman level in higher education. All you really would have to do to admit students is weight grades at 50%, weight what I call board scores, the most significant test scores at 50%, and let in the best kids. I would also give a 50-point edge to varsity athletes, which would be pretty big in this model. And, you know, that would be that. I mean, that's how you do athletics, short of maybe like D1 single A, maybe the same for musicians. That's it. That's your admissions process. And it takes you 1 day every spring to admit your students. So if Harvard just started doing that, I mean, they get the best applicants in the country. They could fill their class with all 1,600 SATs. Yeah. I mean, they'd be 39% Asian as opposed to 24%. I don't see a problem with that at all. And we got a comment, lols, that's a shocking answer. Yeah, I mean, we've gotten so used to thinking of all this stuff like HR as this complicated, bullshit process.
Yeah.
You know, are we going to have 11% Hispanic males this year? It doesn't matter. All you have to do is take everyone with a GPA over 4.5. I mean, those are your students. So they could do that. I mean, that's it. But they're not going to do that. I think you have another question, but I mean, basically what they're going to do, I would say, like I'm in a couple group chats with executive or with academic types. I'm never going to name any of them. But what they're talking about already is, can we replace race with something? So Roberts gives a loophole in the case where he says, now race can't be considered, but at least at the level of an individual couple of dozen applications, if you've experienced racism, we could consider that as part of what you call a process of adversity. It's very easy to see colleges moving from we're admitting, 10% blacks to we're admitting 10% maximum adversity score performers. And that's what I think is pretty likely.
Yeah. If Pete was president of Harvard, we would do it in 1 day. I would Elon Musk my staff and be like, I don't need most of you guys here. We're going to send you home. And we got a $60 billion endowment. It's going to keep growing. So I'm not charging anybody to come here. If your parents want to pay, great, we'll let them. But, just get that thing lean and, just make it simple. We can really simplify a lot of these things. one of the things that Sowell gets into, and you kind of got into that a little bit, but I want to dive in a little deeper, is he does talk about the cultural aspects, and he talks about how the Germans would go to their farmland and just work the shit out of these things. He talks, I don't know if it's in this book, but in a bunch of these books of how the Germans leave Germany and they're like, hey, here's how you make beer, Chinese people. Here's how you make beer, Mexican folks. And they just do this everywhere. But you have these other cultures. And he talks about the Irish specifically. And there's another factor, and I don't know if I got this from him or somewhere else, but when you're a landed family, the oldest usually inherits that land. And so the second, third, fourth sons have to go off to the West in the case of the United States. And these are a little bit more wild guys. Maybe, Darwin is not a first son. So he goes and becomes a chaplain, hops on a boat and writes an incredible paper and changes how we think about evolution. That's what these sons have to do is they have to go West. And they get a little crazy because you got to be a little bit nuts to go into the hinterlands. And so you do have these cultural people, to go to Australia, you got to be a little bit crazy. And so there is a little bit of a requirement to settle that down. That does take probably a generation or two to get the norms back into place, if it only takes that long. You look at like the different Japanese, they even have names for the Japanese generations. And by the time you get to the third and fourth generations, they're completely different. And they're no longer, if they go back to Japan, they're not Japanese anymore. They're Americans.
Yeah. So definitely, I think it's fair to say that ethno-states have cultures. Even non-ethno states like the USA have cultures, but it gets a little more complicated. They tend to be more shifting, more mercurial over time. But I mean, like when you talk about German culture or Japanese culture, certainly in the pre-television era, there were things that were pretty constant for 1,000 years. And that could, well, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, 500 years, but that could allow you to compete in certain different ways when you got to other societies. So yeah, like one of the most obvious that you mentioned is that when the Germans got to other cultures and other countries, they were the beer brewers. Like almost every major brand of beer around the world, including China's Qingdao and the USA's Budweiser, was first brewed by a German. The only challenger might be an Irishman, but I mean, those guys spent a little more time consuming the product, let's say.
Yeah, they ran the pub.
Yeah, they were drinking the beer they brewed. So they tended to be more the local brewers. You didn't get equivalents of Guinness or Harp all around the world. Yeah, I don't know if there's much more to say there, but yeah, the culture obviously impacts how you do when you move to new societies. And when you look at ethno populations that were stable pre-TV era for hundreds or thousands of years, there were very stable cultures that we've seen spread around the world. So, I mean, people have described the overseas Chinese, who are members of the Chinese business class that usually got into conflicts back home, as the Jews of Asia. And because the overseas Chinese population is something like 5 times the global Jewish population, that might make more sense in reverse, actually. But you have these people that have gone to countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma, Thailand even, and ended up controlling Philippines, most of the mercantile sector there. So yeah, that kind of stuff is extremely interesting. Like what do people, certainly in the pre-modern era, even today, when you look at Asian study culture, it usually lasts 5 generations, what do they bring into new societies? And if what they bring in is at a higher level than the same thing within the guest or the host society, that group is going to become very dominant, very prevalent, sometimes very criticized, very popular, very unpopular. I mean, one example of this, and I think we already covered this, so I don't want to just like babble on about it, but like one example is when people make that joke about, every time you go to a 7-Eleven, you see an Indian American, middle-class family, daughter running the till. I mean, it's something that's stereotypical. It's true in about 60% of stores. That's because there's a caste in India that specializes in running small markets. They're the best people in the world at it, and they run almost all of the small markets in India. And when that group comes to the USA, I'm sure that they kind of see this as amateur hour. It's a bunch of, brothers and rednecks and random immigrants from other countries that keep the store open from, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. And the people from the clade that have trained professionally to do this for hundreds of years, that fought the Crusaders and, Iskander's troops away from their markets, will do better. They'll have connections for product in many cases around the world. They'll work longer hours. And so you'll see incredible dominance of that sector, which includes 7-Eleven and Dunkin' Donuts and Speedway gas stations. I mean, there are entire businesses where 70% of the franchises are now owned by upper middle class Indian Americans. So that is that impact of culture around the world. And that, and Ouroboros says caste systems. Yeah, a lot of people don't understand how complex a quote unquote jati system is. Yes, we don't. That is correct. The comment. We don't have anything close to a caste system. The USA has some mild racial discrimination within otherwise roughly fair hiring and admissions processes. A caste system is a system in which you are born at birth into a particular jati. The Indian term would serve pretty well for what the European ranks were through. Someone might correct this, but the 1400s, something like that. But you're born into a particular rank. You're a Villian who specializes in hunting. And that's what you do. You train under your dad or the guild master in your town, and that's what you become. You have no other job options, or maybe one or two other job options. You can become a sailor if you walk down to the coast, and that's you. And in India and other caste societies, you still have a great deal of this. So it's not just like we think of the four big castes, which are Brahmin, you know, on top, at least in their own mind, Kshatriya, which is where we would fall, traveling merchant and warrior. You have, actually, I might be a Brahmin because I teach. You have Vasya, which is artisan, regular merchant, craftsman, and you have Sudra, which is regular laborer or little farmer. And all of those contain 30 or 40 or 50 subcastes. Like, are you someone that is a Vasya or Sudra but loses a few points of rank because you work with leather? And so the people in those clades tend to be incredibly specialized. And anyway, blah, blah, blah. But much of Europe, most of West Africa was like that as well until quite recently. So free will actually itself is kind of interesting. Like, we do have agency. We now know that as a human being, you make a lot of decisions with the top conscious level of your mind. We now know those are based on your own individual experiences and genetic preferences. There's no Cartesian demon living in your head. But you can only use your agency in certain types of systems like ours. Like, if you're born in India in the 1700s or medieval Europe in the 1100s, and someone tells you, you know, you're a warrior ranking just below a knight, your title is man-at-arms, you're in the Kshatriya clade, and within your village you can marry one of these 7 women, there's not a lot of shit you can do. Like, you're very constrained in the choices that are available to you. And one of the positive effects of US-style capitalist democracy has been the vast expansion of the choices that are available to people.
You know, I'm going to be a little bit on
caste systems.
Yeah, no, I think it's great, and it makes me think about something. And I'll bring it back around to Sowell because it all comes back to Sowell. But I knew a guy who was a football coach, and this goes into the diversity and how you look at these things. And if you want to find this diversity in these athletes or whatever it's going to be, his model. He was a high school football coach at a private school in Florida. And here's model, and he never lost. He was JV, and so he's like, I wanted to know what neighborhood these guys came from, and he's like, my first indicator was I want to know how many gold teeth these kids had. I wanted them to be from the hardest neighborhood in Florida. He was not kidding, because he wanted Snoop Menace. If you guys remember Snoop, he wanted a guy like Snoop Menace, you know, and he wanted it like, and he knew the neighborhood. Like, he would know. It's like, okay, you're from that neighborhood. Yes, I'll take a look at you. I'll give you a shot. And then he would talk to the guys in that neighborhood. He would find out who was good. And that sounds terrible, except for you realize, like, the Dodgers and those other teams that followed them would go to San Pedro de Macorís, and they realized that Dominican Republic was full of baseball talent. Why? Well, they didn't have enough money and they could play baseball. They didn't go to Haiti because they didn't do it there, right? And so that level of poverty, but that level of passion turned into something that was valuable. And so they were able to create something out of that. And so this is like the Sowellian example of the Chinese folks who were just like, we're going to outwork all of the people that we live amongst, you know, these middlemen who do these things. And he constantly finds these examples of people that stand out. And there they are, if you're willing to look for them, and they're available, and they can go to Harvard, or they can do whatever it is here in America. And so you don't have to create a policy. You can just simply focus your energy on a group or a region or whatever it is to identify folks. I think to satisfy any kind of ethnicity or culture that you want to identify and bring into your school to create some kind of diversity without worrying about skin color. Or you can identify any group, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, well, that gets into culture versus genetics. I mean, except for the fact that Haitians are more black and poorer, and you'd expect them to be better at sports, if anything, there aren't really many major differences between Haitians and Dominicans. The difference is a cultural difference.
Right.
So, I mean, like, once you get through some basic genetic or metacultural baselines, like, I love my Filipinos, but they're probably not going to be that good at basketball, because the average Pinoy male is like 5'3", 5'4".
Yeah.
I mean, the diet's changing. But I mean, unless you raise the hoop or something, I mean, those guys are going to be D2 players. But once you get through those kind of basic bottlenecks, like, most things are cultural. So to give an example, like 8% of the whites and 2 or 3% of all the players in the NBA, I guess 2%, are from the country of Slovenia. Slovenia is a tiny European postage stamp, beautiful, castle dotted land, 2 or 3 million people. It's about the size of Kentucky, very similar in some ways. Kentucky also produces a disproportionate number of both the whites and overall athletes in the NBA, by the way. You look at, Big Blue, you look at our high schools. So these are all cultural differences. There's no difference between Kentucky blacks and whites and people elsewhere in the country. Same with Utah. There's certainly no difference between Slovenians and other Caucasians or other Slavs. So, I mean, now they're tall. If the average height of a Slovenian were 5'4", again, you wouldn't see a lot of Slovenians in the L, although you'd see some in D1. But what makes them good? Well, they play basketball. Like, the national sport of the former Yugoslavia was basketball. And it turns out that a disproportionate number of the old leftover basketball goals and the better quality gyms, the A gyms, are in the country of Slovenia. So if you're a poor country, and another thing, you still have families that are on average 4 or 5 kids, 1 or 2 boys at least, there are going to be a lot of people playing basketball proportionally in these pretty good facilities. So that's why Slovenians dominate the game. It's the same thing with Dominicans. The island used to be called something like the home of the shortstops, jokingly, in Latin America, because there's so many ball players in there. And Latin America is all people that are part black, part white, and play sport occasionally. The thing with the Dominicans is they focused on baseball. They were poor enough to be hungry. They weren't so poor that they didn't have training facilities and so on. And you ended up with this culture that churned out a lot of baseball players. And by the way, this, in terms of, like, again, we don't need to get into like the cult versus hereditarian versus racism stuff, but, like, for whatever reason, this is something you see pretty often. Like, when you say, if you just had purely fair admission standards, Harvard would be 70% Asian and Jewish, people recoil from that, like that's something unusual. But no, there are very slight differences between human groups. And they don't matter at all in terms of the ordinary guy. This is something I want to emphasize. Like, if you say the average black tested IQ right now is 91, and for whites it's 99, but it's closer to the black IQ in the states where black people live, and you're hiring construction workers, like, none of this matters at all. Especially if you add in that the black guy might have been a little more likely to have played some varsity football, might be more used to getting along with different kinds of people. You just hire the first 5 guys that apply if they're sober. But when you look at who's going to become an astronaut, then it starts becoming pretty relevant. And people have to get used to the idea that fair competition is going to produce these disparities all over the place. 90% of the top 100 Mexican-style chefs in this country are going to be Mexican-American. The NBA is 70% plus black. Harvard would be 70% Asian and Jewish. And you know what? Like, there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
Like, I don't care about that. I don't care if all of my doctors, when in 15 years I go into that cancer ward or that heart attack ward, as men do. Like, I don't care if all my doctors are Pakistani, as long as they're capable of saving my life. If I walk in there and I see something that looks like, the old Benetton ads, people, blue-haired white women hugging burly black dudes and, like, stylish Hispanic guys filling up catheters and needles, and I kind of have some questions about the scores these people brought into college, I'm actually going to be less comfortable. So cultures, more than genetic breakdowns, more than experiences with racism, produce outcomes that often cause, at what we'd say the ends of the tail, pretty dramatic differences in production. And yeah, you can easily wind up with a situation where one small island produces 20% of the players in Major League Baseball. You can easily wind up with a situation where one little country produces 8% of the whites in the NBA. I guess my point, so again, you got the comment, well, it's an outliers versus averages thing. I focus on outliers. I think you have to focus on both.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't, but there's nothing wrong with it unless you can demonstrate that the disparity is due to racism. And Sowell's point in the book is that you usually can't.
Right.
That's
right.
it. That's kind of reconnecting the two. Like, why do Asians make more money than whites? There's a great cultural argument. There's some genetic argument. I think it's pretty weak. There's no racism argument. No one argues whites experience more racism than Asians. There's a regionalist argument. Asians tend to be based in the most intense West Coast cities, So we can just debate all of that. But the simple reality is that it is happening, and it's not due to anything evil. So while it's happening, we may as well let those Asian guys go to the best schools in the country.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just discriminating against them.
And again, the cultural and geographical nature of these things, it's just, if you have a lot of mountains around you, makes you a cloistered kind of society, and you have to take care of each other. That over generations changes how you interact with societies. It just does. And it makes things different in how you see the world. And when you go to a place like Harvard or wherever it is, you just act differently than someone who lives on a beach. Doesn't mean you can't perform. It just means you act differently, and these things, they matter more than race does. That's for sure. I wanted to get into, because it's so interesting, in my lifetime, people that I've interviewed have talked about the impact of busing on their life. And as we tried to sort out separate but equal in terms of like, hey, how are we going to do this? And what people self-selected into or self-avoided away from, busing was this problem, the projects and all of these things that failed, and yet continue to still be people's good ideas. And we see new forms of it. Let's talk about what Sowell has to say about busing in schools. And by the way, in part of what we just talked about was, and I'll just say, the left's unwillingness to look at the success of Catholic schools who focused on Black kids and had them do really well. And he talks about this over and over again, like you have these successful programs. I'm using the Catholic Black schools, but any number of them. He talks about this is like, why don't we study and replicate these programs that worked? What is the problem here, right? And so let's talk about all this schooling aspect, because there's some really interesting things. And if we do care about rights and people, why are we so stubborn about this?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of stuff here. I mean, so actually, like, going back through some of these comments here for a quick second, one thing that Daniel says that's worth mentioning is this idea of therapeutic alienation. Like, when we talk about things in different cultures that cause performance up or down, that don't have much of anything to do with genetics, that don't have much of anything to do with racism. As I understand it, the idea of TI, of therapeutic alienation, or TA, I guess, is that people who are placed into situations where they have to compete with people who are better prepared at thing X tend to avoid failing and feeling embarrassed, kind of present thing X as being bad, if that makes sense. So there's a whole long history of Black kids who are placed into white schools with, let's be honest, more highly performing, generally more advanced across the subject students, coming to define education itself as kind of being white, being something that's not cool, being something that you don't spend a lot of time on, and focusing in things that were thought of as more Black. Like, so John McWhorter, for example, talks a lot about how Black students spend time in high school playing sports, which they or we tend to be pretty good at versus competitors, seeking social popularity, chasing girls, and so on. And that is a cultural thing. Like, you're coming from a more working class culture. So, I mean, like, if you're asking what are the cultural variables that might explain this versus race or genes, I mean, it's pretty simple. Like, you have a background where it was illegal to educate you. No excuses, but it was until 80 years ago. You're now, even today, you're a more working class community. You're a more Southern community. Southern whites don't pay a ton of attention in school either. I'm obviously speaking at the average. Younger parents, single moms. So when you get into school, even in terms of like the number of words you've heard before age 7, that's not going to be very high relative to your classmates. So you normally end up struggling. And I don't think a lot of people understand the extent to which this is true. Like, the average Black student, the 50th percentile Black kid, is in the bottom 5th of their class, like every time from 4th grade on. So You come in, you're unprepared. You deal with that unpreparedness by saying, fuck school. Excuse the language, but like, this ain't me. I've heard this a lot from kids, many of whom I've coached up to be A or B students. So, I know that potential is there. Then, you just kind of screw off. And so you wind up with these test scores. This explains a phenomenon, by the way, that Ibram Kendi types and quote unquote race realists argue about, which is that IQ for minority groups keeps dropping in the USA as people get older, which is something that would make no sense based on how human genetic development works. So like at 95, about age 8 or 9, according to a famous paper from Dickens and Flynn, 2006, the average black IQ is about 95. It's 95.5. At the end of high school, that's where I get that 91 figure I use. I think that's the most reliable. But then it keeps dropping. It's down to like 88 by 25, even from the numbers used by these liberal social scientists. Why is that? The idea of TA and the idea of almost rejecting education provides an answer. Like year by year, you get less and less interested and you think this thing you think is insulting you. If you ask blacks, do you read for fun? It's a way lower figure than it is for whites, including, frankly, dumb whites, like big white jocks and so on, are much more likely to say, yeah, I struggle with this a little bit, but yeah, I'll bring a book. I'll bring one of the classic adventure stories and I'll read it. Black people are less likely to, versus electronic entertainment and so on. So I think that's cultural. And yeah, Daniel says that's a form of self-fulfilling prophecy. I think this is true all over the map. I don't want to keep returning to books and sports, but I'm a competitive male, and those are kind of the two classics, right? Like when you look at the NBA is almost 30% white again, but they're all from Slovenia. They're all from these little postcard countries. Why? There are a lot of great white athletes in Alabama, Mississippi. They're playing baseball and football. Why aren't they playing basketball? A lot of that would have to be because it's perceived as being a somewhat hostile black environment. And all of this is cultural. You think if you play basketball, the coach is going to put you on the bench. You might hear some stupid jokes from black teammates. Girls might not think it's as cool for a quote unquote white boys playing baseball as a pitcher, playing football as a quarterback. So you're less likely to do it. It's the other group's thing. So there's a really serious question here, kind of cutting off this little tirade. How do you convince people that things that we need everyone to do, like reading for blacks or fitness for Caucasians, how do you convince people that this is something everyone needs to train on, to develop for their group? It's an interesting question. And this is all completely separate from the, like, does racism play some role, or is there some genetic component here? It's just like, obviously there are a lot of white guys in the South that could play basketball, and almost none of them do. Why? Yeah. It's a fascinating question.
You're so right about this too, because I played all over. I played in Oakland, Richmond, Vallejo. I played everywhere. I had a ball in the back of my car, shoes. I had shoes in different courts, all that. But invariably, when I played, I often was called dead legs, which was a play on deadlift, shrimp, because he was a player back then. Had nothing to do with my game. It was just the white guy's name, right? And they all thought I could shoot. And so I would use that to my advantage because I wasn't a particularly good outside shooter. It was all stereotypical. And I would hustle my ass off. I would pass the ball and I would play D like a motherfucker. And they didn't know what to do with me, but they were always hostile to me. And they would talk all kinds of shit to me, and I would set monstrous picks. And when they set picks to me, I would hit them. I would hit them as hard as I could. And I got into a lot of near fights. But because I played hard, I could play with them. But I had to put up with a lot of bullshit to do that. And because I put up with a lot of bullshit, they eventually would accept me. But I had to go through all of that to play with them. And absolutely would have been easier for me not to do that, or just to play with, on courts with white people or whatever it was. But I enjoyed the challenge of playing with really good people. And I got dunked on by Brent Barry one time. Really bad. So just not about basketball, but I had to throw that in there because that's a really funny Brent Barry story. I don't want to take you too much of your time, and we're coming up on the end. The last chapter is really interesting, where he sort of just closes on rhetoric or reality. Do you want to just go off on that for a minute or two?
Yeah, rhetoric or reality. So let's take a look at this. Yeah, it's basically, that's actually the chapter I read the least of. Let's be honest to the audience here. But the whole theme of the book, and it looks like from just a quick scan of the first 2 pages, the theme of this last chapter is how does the reality of U.S. group development and group development overall match what we often hear about it? And so the rhetoric of the civil rights movement is like, we good people, like black leaders, white libs, so on, gave these field Negroes rights. And then they began developing, and you started seeing black congressmen and black newspapers and so on down the line. Sowell gives several examples. But what Sowell does in this book is actually look empirically, like the number of black newspapers, the amount of black wealth, and so on, and make these empirical points. Like the average black family left poverty in the 1930s. You know, I mean, there was, and now some of this was due to Reconstruction effects, which I don't, this doesn't minimize the Klan coming later, but the first black senators and governors like PBS Pinchback were the 1880s, 1890s. So, I mean, you saw this long progress of this group of people. And again, one thing I will say about this that's going to irritate probably a lot of black people, but like there's the American black experience is not extraordinarily unique. I mean, there's a group of people that were captured in war and that were sold as slaves to successful allies of their enemies. This has happened to the Jews. I would argue that the Irish experience was very, very close to slavery. There was white slavery in the Mediterranean Sea to black and Muslim conquerors, the Barbary slave trade. There was a diverse Arabic slave trade in blacks and whites. Now, all these others left plenty of descendants. The reason that Arabic slave trade did not is that the Arabs would cut your cock off if you were a white or black fighting man and they caught you. They would literally castrate you, and their castration technique was just you chop off the dick and the balls. I don't know a better way to put that. So, I mean, there weren't a lot of kids in that one. But, I mean, you had all these slave trades around the world. I mean, in Russia, they technically didn't have slaves. They had chattel serfs who are disproportionately likely to be what they call black asses, Central Asians. So you had all these groups of people that were defeated warriors that wound up in another society and that were, you know, getting to practice their boat rowing or their field hoeing skills for a pretty good long period of time. And at a certain point in the modern era, most of these groups became liberated. We saw the liberation of whole countries in Africa and Eastern Europe, by the way. And you now have to watch these groups move forward. That's a bit of a sideline from what I was saying. But what Sowell says is that the development by members of this human group that wound up in an unpleasant position of skills that all human groups need had more to do with their march forward than like their assignment of freedom by good ethical liberals in the previous enemy group. And I think that's just correct. And we see this all around us. I mean, if you look at groups that are socially disadvantaged today, Asians, gays until recently, many of them outperform the norm. So there has to be some set of tools that allows them to do that. Even if you still want to say, okay, that's fine, but I want to get rid of racism because I see it as an evil. Okay, I'm probably with you. But you have to teach the people that you think are the victims of racism those tools that the Asians and the gays and the overseas Chinese are using. And that's Sowell's point. Like if you just quote unquote free people and allow them to do whatever they want, allow them to engage in ghetto-ass culture, which has been very much the case for urban blacks, and by the way, Appalachian poor whites. There's no intervention. People just say, oh, well, the traditional folk ways of the people. This is true on Indian reservations too, I bet. I've never spent a lot of time there. If you allow people to do that, it's like allowing homeless people to sleep under bridges. Like you're not being kind at all. Mm-hmm. What you're actually doing is condemning people to life in the ghetto. Because if you don't know how to read, write, do math, do your taxes, so on at a certain level, read the newspaper, read a map if you're traveling, you can't afford GPS in the car, I mean, on and on and on, you're not going to be successful in life.
Yeah. I do have one more thing I want to bring in because Sowell talks about this, and I want to make sure we at least bring it up, is we often talk about these gaps, and he brings up the gap, the enormous gap, and at least in the book, in the time between Jews and Puerto Ricans, and how like, oh, we don't care about this gap. Like we have this huge thing. And again, multivariate analysis answers for it, but we have these gaps that we actually don't care about, but we do care about the white and black gap. So do you have anything to say about Puerto Ricans and Jews, or Puerto Ricans in general, because they sort of get kind of cast aside? And I think it's also important to note with Puerto Ricans, because they represent what a lot of people are, is you have the folks that want to be part of America, that want the status quo, and then also don't want to be part of America. And you always have this conundrum of what freedom is, and it's always these three different slices. You know, the French Canadians, we want to be with you, fuck you, we don't want to be part of you, and then also just, hey, what's the status quo, like this kind of melodramatic steady fight state. We have these groups of people that have to live together, but none of them want to agree on what way to go.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a lot of things there. I mean, so one of the points that Sowell makes pretty often is that there aren't 2 or 3 groups in a big country like the USA. I mean, there are hundreds. This is one of the responses, by the way, to anyone who kind of leans a little to the dissident right side of things and tries to say the USA is an ethno state. That's arguable if you argue that like whites are a group and then like blacks are a slightly subordinate group. The problem is that we're not talking about like somewhere in Southern Europe where you have one white group and then like one Bantu group. Whites are 65 groups. Blacks are, I think, 14. So, I mean, in fact, we're a wildly diverse country. And if you break open those white and black categories, you see a range of income, IQ, so on, that's far more dramatic than you see between the main 2 groups. And again, this is a big problem for hereditarianism. It's a big problem for a lot of theoretical claims, not our topic today.
Right.
Like Puerto Ricans are one of many white groups. I'm not sure how to assign Puerto Ricans into that category anymore, looking at like current demographics on the island and so on. But Puerto Ricans are one of many white groups that do as well as or a little worse than American blacks in income terms. That's mostly due to age, unique culture. In terms of things like would I accept Puerto Rico as a state? Probably not. We have enough broke states of our own. But I mean, it's kind of just there is that kind of triune set of options. And as a conservative, I'm generally inclined to go with a status quo that works. So we could make Puerto Rico, a full-on U.S. state. And obviously I'm not denigrating the islands, the abbreviation, but like we could make them a full-on U.S. state. We could let them go, or we could keep them as a fairly well-liked territory, which is what I think we should do. It's worth noting, by the way, that we offered, when they were performing a bit better, Puerto Rico statehood something like twice, and they rejected it. So, I mean, the idea that the cruel American conquerors have tried to deny the beautiful native women and men of the island equal citizenship. No, I mean, it's been offered over and over, and they've said no several times. So I don't think we have any more obligation down that path. It's something we'll discuss over the next decade or so. But Sowell's point when he talks about Puerto Ricans, Italians, Greeks, Irishmen, Cajuns, Appalachians, is that it's meaningless to just say whites. Like if you go to the Britannica or Wikipedia list of incomes by white ethnic group, you're going to find a dramatic distinction between like Englishmen, Scotsmen, Irishmen, Northern Irishmen, and Appalachians. There's no way that's due to racism. There's no way it's due to genetics. What's it due to? That's a question that's not asked enough, but that's pretty important. That's pretty relevant.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, what book do you want to do next?
How about the affirmative action one? Affirmative action around the world. Would you do that one?
Yeah, let's do it. Affirmative action around the world. I'm going to pull that up right now, and then I'll put the link in. Affirmative. I can't talk and type at the same time.
Sure.
I'll put the link up here for everybody, and we can affirmative action around the world, an empirical study by Thomas Sowell. Here comes the link for all who want to participate with us. Bam, there's a couple of comments here I didn't put up. Here comes Mike and Mr. Richard with his many comments. Thanks, as always, Dickie, for your always hilarious extra names and stuff. And once again, here's the link to the book that we'll do. And I'm going to be doing a charity ride, so I'm not sure when we'll get to this. It could be back. It could be in August. We might be able to squeeze it in before I go, but I go on the 18th, everybody. So it might not get done until August, but we'll get it done either way. Just look out for it. And anything in closing at all?
No, I think we've covered most of the major points from the book, to be honest.
Yeah, and I got to reference Snoop Minnis, which was always a win.
One of the OGs in the youth game, definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Take care, everybody. Thanks for being on the show, Will. Bye-bye.
Peace, bro.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching.